The materials for the story which I present to you have been collected over the course of several years. The initial spark of interest was the story my uncle told me in my childhood, who in the 70s to the 80s of the last century worked as an investigator in our small city located in Novosibirsk region. I began purposefully to collect information that could shed light on the unsolved mystery mentioned by my uncle. I examined archives and newspaper subcases, asked witnesses, got acquainted with materials of old criminal cases using my connections, etc. The conclusion I finally came to looks utterly fantastic and unrealistic, but when you compare the facts, it is the only rationally possible, as far as that word applies here, explanation of the events that took place in our city over the decades. There is, of course, no actual evidence for my version of the story, but it still seems compelling enough for me to present it to a wide range of readers. I will begin with a story told by my uncle in a family circle in the 1990s. The fall of 1977 came as a terrible shock for the investigators in our town. One of the mushroom hunters, who was walking through the nearby woods in search of a place rich in beach mushrooms, stumbled upon a small clearing about 5 kilometers from the city limits where he saw suspicious mounds. It looked like something was buried in the clearing. The vigilant citizen turned to the police, and a day later, the entire local Department of Internal Affairs was on its ears. The investigation team discovered a real secret cemetery in a nondescript wooded area. 48 dismembered bodies without coffins were found under graves all over the glade. It was an emergency of a national scale. Moscow immediately took control of the case, and Minister Shekalov was informed about the discovery. The general public, as usual, knew nothing. Everything was immediately classified. A committee of high-ranking investigators arrived from the capital and took the investigation into their own hands. But some local officers of the UVD, like my uncle, also had access to information. It turned out that all the bodies were naked and buried without much effort. The bodies belonged exclusively to teenagers and young men. The oldest was roughly 22 to 25 years old. Most of them were girls, but there were bodies of guys too. The bodies were not buried in one day, but the degree of decomposition was an indication that the graves had been made gradually over a period of almost 10 years. The most recent grave, which attracted the attention of the mushroom hunter, had been dug no earlier than 6 months ago. The most eerie circumstances was that all these boys and girls did not die of natural causes. Experts who examined the bodies found numerous mutilations which they believed had been inflicted while they were still alive. Bone fractures, scars, injuries to the musculature and skin. Simply put, all had been subjected to horrific torture before being killed. Some of the bodies had their limbs severed alive. Only a psychopathic maniac could have done this. Law enforcement was in shock. Everyone was prepared for heads to roll. To have missed the disappearance of 50 or so boys and girls over the course of 10 years in a quiet little town would have given them a stern accountability. In fact, the bigwigs from the capital were at first furious, banging their fists on the table and promising terrible penalties. But the further they went, the more they realized that not everything was as straightforward as it seemed. First of all, it was quite unclear where all of these bodies had come from. People going missing, of course, had happened in the town, like everywhere else, but not en masse like this gravesite would suggest, and most of them later found their own explanation. Either the body of the missing person was found, or it was found out that he had simply run away from home. Even if you added up the 10 years of unsolved teenage disappearances in the whole region, it was not such a grand occurrence. Of course, there was a theory that the bodies could have been brought from neighboring regions, but this version was not confirmed later either. Secondly, the identification of the bodies was a disaster. Most of the bodies were unrecognizable because of decomposition, but many had special features that could help identify them. We combed through all the file cabinets and storage rooms, pulled up old statements and documents. Not a single match. It was something absolutely impossible. The search for evidence was inconclusive too. The perpetrator or the perpetrators had left no trace on the bodies or in the clearing that could lead the investigating team to them. If there were any prints and traces, Time and weather conditions had long since destroyed them. The investigators had one option left: to lay low and wait. If the killers had been burying bodies in the clearing for years, sooner or later they would reappear, and it would be possible to catch them red-handed. Remember, at that point, no one except the investigators and the city's top brass knew about the accident. The clearing had been under surveillance for several years. A couple of times, they detained random mushroom pickers who wandered into it, but every time they were let go. The 48 bodies sent to Moscow for analysis were buried there in unmarked graves when the time limit expired. The terrible mystery of the secret cemetery on the outskirts of the sleepy town remains unsolved. The second part of the story, unlike the first, was in print, but did not cause a stir outside of the town itself. The case was tragic, but, as they say, not exceptional. On September 15th, 1982, a bloody drama took place in a private sector house on the outskirts of the city. The first secretary of the city party committee, V.N. Shavalev, and his wife, O.P. Shavaleva. The investigation was brief. In fact, there was nothing to investigate. The picture was very clear. The 31-year-old G.R. Protopopov, a cousin of Shavalev, lived at the dacha together with the Shavalevs. Protopopov was mentally disabled since childhood and should have been placed in an institution, but Shavalev kept him with him because of his family ties. His brother actually served the dacha and watched over it in the absence of the owner. It was established that on that fateful evening, Protopopov waited for the owners to fall asleep, took an axe from the larder, went upstairs to the second floor, and hacked to death the husband and wife. Shavalev was murdered in his sleep by the first blow of the axe to his forehead, and a little later, the murderer killed his wife by cutting an artery in her neck with the axe blade. Such details, of course, were not in the press. I extracted them from the criminal case materials. Newspapers only reported the tragic death of the first secretary and his wife at the hands of a deranged relative. After that, Protopopov went to sleep on the first floor. In the morning, Shavalev's chauffeur arrived at the dacha to take him to work. He found the bodies and called the police. The murderer did not try and escape and was detained on the spot. G.R. Protopopov was declared insane and sent for involuntary treatment in a Novosibirsk psychiatric hospital. According to the documents, he died there in 2003 at the age of 52 from complications from a cold. In 2005, a local newspaper in the town published an article about some yellow-colored spheres that city residents regularly saw in the surrounding woods. The publication provoked a lively response from readers and had several sequels. The editorial office received more and more letters from eyewitnesses who had noticed these very balls at various times. It turns out that many have seen them since the 50s of the last century. The spheres of small size, shining like electric bulbs, moved silently through the woods on a chaotic route. When one attempted to approach them, they promptly receded. Some wrote that they saw whole groups of such spheres moving in sync. No one was able to see them close up. Experts in the editorial office expressed the common opinion that it was most likely ball lightning, more so because lightning often strikes trees in the forest near the town during thunderstorms. However, the orbs were seen in clear weather, both during the day and at night. Two facts caught my attention in the light of my research, or investigation, in these publications. First, the frequency of the incidents. It is no secret that ball lightning is observed everywhere, though rarely, and here almost every year, there are eyewitnesses who claim to have personally seen it. Lightning strikes in trees are more frequent, but also not as abundant as described in readers' stories. I did my own analysis and made sure that our city really is a statistical anomaly in this regard. Lightning-burned trees. I myself went to the forest to look at them at the behest of the residents, and people who claim to see yellow flying balls are indeed a lot. During this analysis, I have discovered the second very important fact. The distribution of lightning strikes and appearances of the balls is far from uniform. The overwhelming majority of these cases occurred within a radius of 2 to 3 kilometers in the woods on the northern side of the city. Moreover, this radius includes the edge of the private sector, where the former dacha of the Shavalevs was located. In 1992, an alarming news piece spread all over the town. Sergei, a 9-year-old boy who went out with his friends to play outside and never came back, disappeared. After 2 days of absence, a search was declared. All means were involved: police, volunteers, radio, TV, leaflets. The search was unsuccessful for a week, and the parents despaired of finding the child alive. And on the 9th day, Sergei himself returned to the house, healthy, in good physical condition, not even hungry. The relatives were overjoyed. When they asked Sergei where he had been, the boy told an incredible story. According to Sergei, he was playing with his peers in a private neighborhood 2 blocks from his home. Close to lunchtime, the boy said goodbye to his friends and headed home alone. This coincided with the testimony of his friends. On his way, he saw a chipmunk on the road, which ran out on the road from the edge of the forest and chased the animal. Since Sergei lived in the private sector since birth, and often played near the edge of the forest, he was not afraid to walk shallowly into the woods. The boy has gone deep into the woods, according to his words, about 250 to 300 meters. He lost sight of the chipmunk and wanted to go back, but then he noticed a woodpecker in a tree, beak tapping on the bark. He started throwing pine cones at the bird. The woodpecker flew over to another tree, thus chasing the bird from tree to tree. The boy spent some time and went even further into the woods. He was not afraid to get lost, because he knew that the edge of the forest was in the direction of the sun. When Sergei got tired of scaring the woodpecker, he walked back, navigating by the sun. He went on, but the forest did not end. Sergei found it difficult to determine how much time he had spent in the forest. At one point, he had to climb over a fence made of poles with pieces of colorful cloth tied to them. No one in town knew about any fence. It simply could not be there. Eventually, the frightened and crying child made it to the edge of the forest, but he did not find any houses there. Beyond the edge of the forest was a grassy plain, a kind of steppe. Here and there were herds of horses grazing. Not far from the edge, the boy saw a settlement of tent-like structures. The boy, having calmed down a little, went towards the settlement. As he approached, the people living there spotted him and came towards him. Their speech remained completely incomprehensible to Sergei. The boy was frightened again and began to cry. The people who met him tried to calm him down, stroked his head, and looked worried. Sergei described the inhabitants of the settlement as people of medium height, with skin of the usual light color for him, blue-eyed, with light blonde hair that is, in appearance that did not differ from the Russians, but still spoke a different language and were quite different. The clothes of these people were also unusual. Sergei could not clearly explain what the differences were, or he was not asked about it in detail. The transcript only records that he said that these people's clothes were not like ours. According to Sergei, he spent the next week in the settlement with these people. Unfortunately, from the moment the boy met with the strange people, the transcript of his testimony attached to the case file has cut off. I could not find a full transcript. It was either lost, or at some point, the police stopped recording the boy's words, considering it a child's fantasy. The only source of further information is an article in a Moscow yellow newspaper, in which an anonymous relative of Sergei recounts his story in 1995. The article, unfortunately, is full of florid metaphors, pompous details, and other obvious inventions of the author, so I will only give the most general gist of what happened next. From the story, we can understand that the boy spent a week in the settlement, in a state of shock from nervous shock. The owners of the tent treated the foundling affectionately, did not hurt him, gave him water, milk, and shared their table with him, mostly consisting of berries, dairy products, and meat, probably horse meat, since the locals bred horse. The boy slept on a separate low wooden bed, judging by the description, just a trestle bed. At the same time, everyone behaved aloof, even without aggression. They did not try to talk to Sergei. They did not allow their curious children to approach him, and when he went outside, they followed him separately. Such behavior indicated that all this time, they, probably, were waiting for someone. On the last day, a man, whom Sergei had never seen before, appeared in the tent, a tall, tan man with crystal, It is not explained what the boy meant by this. He talked about something with the hosts, then approached the boy, gave him a wooden bowl with a brew reminiscent of fish soup, and gestured for him to drink. The frightened child drank the liquid, which tasted rather disgusting, and soon lost consciousness. All he remembered was that at some point, half conscious, he felt that he was being carried in his arms through the woods. Judging by the sound of crystals, he was being carried by the tall guest. Sergei did not remember anything else. He woke up lying in the woods in his clothes. He got up, saw that the sun was high above the horizon, and walked in its direction, remembering that that was how he had left the forest the last time. After a while, he found himself at the edge of the forest near the 66th block. That's not far from the private sector. When he recognized his home, the boy was glad and ran home immediately. Although I have not been able to find Sergei, his relatives, or the police officers who handled the case, it is certain that the case is not a newspaper story or fiction, since the boy's disappearance had once stirred up the public in the city. After the boy's safe return, it was announced in the newspapers that Sergei had simply been wandering in the woods all that time, eating berries and drinking water from a pond. Nevertheless, an incomplete transcript of the boy's testimony, preserved to this day in the archives of the UVD, proves that the truth is far from the official version. And finally, the last document. It is a simple, general notebook in a box, which was something like G.R. Protopov's diary, although diary is a strong word. Rather, it was an ordinary study notebook. At the psychiatric hospital, Protopopov had become friends with a certain Maslev who suffered from schizophrenia sometime towards the end of the 1990s. According to the medical staff, it was Maslev who taught his friend to read and write. It took years, but Maslev, due to the specifics of his illness, had a large reserve of patients. Gradually, Protopopov learned the alphabet and became able to form simple words and then sentences. Undoubtedly, the fact that in the conditions of the dispensary, Protopov's condition noticeably improved and he became capable of learning played a role. In his study notebook, in addition to the usual exercises and what I say and what I write about, Protopopov touched on the events which had brought him to the psychiatric hospital. The notebook came into my possession by accident and in an extremely convoluted way. In 2009, after Protopov's death, Maslev was released from the hospital as his illness had regressed enough for him to no longer pose a threat to himself or society. He took Protopov's notebook with him when he was released, and yet, apparently, Maslev was not completely healthy, as immediately after leaving, he sent the notebook by mail to the Directorate of Internal Affairs in Novosibirsk with a note that Protopopov, during his lifetime, asked to pass his records to the police, and he must comply with the request of his deceased friend. The police department accepted the parcel and immediately sent it, as appropriate, to the archive of incoming correspondence. That is where the main coincidence happened. Without it, there would be no story. Because of its exotic character among clerical documents, the notebook of a madman attracted attention of an archive worker who served in the Department of Internal Affairs in his youth and was familiar, in particular, with the Shavalev case, and my uncle who was in charge of that case in 1982. An employee of the archives seized the notebook, having decided to show it as a curiosity during regular get-togethers with my uncle, who was also retired by that time. My uncle, having received the notebook, later showed it to me. For him and his colleague, Protopov's notebook was nothing more than an amusing relic, a sudden gesture from the past. They did not even try to penetrate into the meaning of what was written. I must say that most of the entries in the notebook were completely innocent, like, "The sun is shining outside. There was porridge for breakfast," and written in an almost unreadable handwriting. I, in turn, borrowed the notebook from my uncle, being interested in the very fact of Diary of a Madman, and after deciphering the contents, I began to remember my uncle's old story about the graves in the clearing to compare and draw conclusions. From this series of coincidences grew my whole investigation. The notes in the notebook are scattered and completely illiterate. There is practically no systematic way of presenting ideas. The same things are often repeated. By the number of repetitions, you can understand what Protopopov attached particular importance to. I will give below something like an abstract of these notes, correcting grammatical errors for readability. Anyway, these mistakes are different every time. An account of what happened. I want to explain what was. I could not talk. I could not write. Now I want to explain. Seva, probably means Shavalev, is a bad man. The sentence is repeated many times throughout the text. Seva is bad. Olya, most likely Olga Shavalev, his wife, is bad. I killed them because they were killing themselves. I wanted to stop them. Seva used to go to the forest, bring a lot of boys and girls from the forest. Seva and Olya used to lock them in a room downstairs and hurt them. I felt sorry for the boys and girls, but I could not help them, so I killed Seva and Olya. I thought they would stop killing. They didn't, but they started again, so I killed Seva and Olya. I gave water to the girl. She was not making any sense. Then Seva and Olya killed her too. I am not bad. Seva and Olya are bad. They won't kill again. Olya likes to drink blood. I killed them because nobody will kill them. I am good. Repeats repeatedly. Seva and Olya wanted me to tamp down. The meaning of the word could not be understood. It was probably a euphemism invented by Protopopov for some action. Boys and girls. I did not want to. They made me do it. I don't like it when boys and girls get hurt. They don't kill anymore. So, what do we have? If we believe what Protopopov writes about, that the first secretary of the city committee, Shavalev, and his wife systematically brought some boys and girls from the forest until 1982, kept them in a downstairs room where they tortured and killed them while forcing their mentally handicapped relatives to take part in this. Note that the clearing where the bodies of the boys and girls with traces of torture were found is located on the same side of town where the private sector is located, hence, not far from the Shavalev's dacha. It is possible to reach that clearing from the dacha directly from the backyard through the forest, without any of the outsiders getting in the way. Protopopov writes that by 1982, Seva and Olya stopped killing for a while, but then picked up the job again. It is high time to remember that the mass graves were discovered in 1977, 5 years before that. If they really did kill and bury teenagers, it is only natural that after the terrible clearing had been found, Seva and Olya laid low for a while and waited until everything had calmed down. It bears repeating that Shavalev was the first secretary of the city committee, i.e., he was one of the few people who was accurately aware of the bloody find. This explains why the ambush in the clearing had no effect. Seva and Olya were already aware that they were being hunted. After 5 years of silence, when the investigation had been dropped and the ambush curtailed, Seva and Olya might have decided that it was time to carefully begin their atrocities anew. So, let's accept as a working theory that Protopopov is right and that respectable Soviet citizens, Shavalev and his wife, were really behind the mass grave. But the main question remains open. Who were their victims? Why were so many teenagers reported missing? And here I come to the most fantastic part of my version, into the realm of pure speculation. First of all, let us pay attention to two interesting details in Protopov's notes. The fact that boys and girls Protopopov took not from anywhere, but from the forest, and also that the girl to whom Protopopov gave water spoke incomprehensibly. In other words, the maniacs looked for their victims not in the city, which would have been more logical, but right in the middle of the forest. Where could so many teenagers come from? At the same time, the victims, at least some part of them, obviously did not speak Russian. Otherwise, how else to explain the fact that the speech of the girl remained incomprehensible to Protopopov? Here it is a good time to remember the yellow balls and frequent lightning strikes in the trees in the area of the forest where the Shavalev's dacha was located. By all indications, a powerful geomagnetic anomaly was, and probably still is, observed in this area. Or maybe, not geomagnetic, but some other one. I am not an expert in this question, but the facts indicate that the area cannot be called ordinary in any way, and somewhere in the depths of this anomalous zone, Seva was driving boys and girls who no one missed, who spoke an unknown language. And the last fragment of the mosaic, the story of the boy Sergei, who went into the woods just in the same area and ended up in an unknown place, where there were people who who spoke an unknown language. Proceeding from everything I've stated above, I have made a supposition that somewhere in the forests, near the private sector in the north of the town, there is a natural anomaly, something like a passage between the worlds. Perhaps the anomaly is present there all the time, perhaps recreated only under certain conditions. One way or another, the Shavalevs were apparently the only ones who found it and understood how to use it consciously, which is not surprising, because the anomaly, apparently, was located near their dacha where the Shavalevs stroll more often than others. But instead of reporting their incredible find to the world, they decided to use it for other purposes. My guess is that by the time of their discovery, the Shavalevs were already murderers. Probably, they did not act so massively then, for fear of exposure, and the discovery of the anomaly gave them exciting new perspectives for atrocities. According to Sergei's testimony, the people living on the other side are not distinguished by a particular level of civilizational development. A physically strong man armed with a gun or a pistol could easily steal or kidnap a teenager from there and drag him to our world by immobilizing and gagging them. After that, all that was left was to move the abductee out of the woods and into the cottage, into the room below. When everything was over, the bodies were buried in a clearing deep in the forest, where the Shavalevs believed they would not be found, although it is not quite clear why the bodies were not sent back to the overworld in order to be certain that no one would find them. Perhaps there were some reasons for this. It is also telling that after getting to the other side, Sergei had to cross a symbolic fence of clearly ritualistic nature in order to get out of the center of the anomalous zone. Probably in this way, the locals, like the customs of many traditional societies of our world, tried to ward off the evil force that comes from this part of the forest and takes their children away. Only they could not have known that this would not save them from the evildoers. The Shavalev scheme was almost flawless. The victims were helpless before them. In our world, no one would miss them. No one would report them to the police. There would be no investigation. Getting another victim and bringing him to the torture chamber was a piece of cake. The villains could not limit their thirst for blood. They did not, in fact. It was their own arrogance and carelessness that failed them. One, they did not bother to hide the bodies securely. The second is that they took the mentally handicapped Protopopov out of the equation, who seemed to them like an unwilling servant whom they could mock on an equal footing with the victims. Maybe it was like that for a while, but between 1977 and 1982, when Sava and Olya lay low, it seems that Protopov's mental state began to improve, and the sight of new blood was no longer tolerated by him, deciding to rendezvous with Sava and Olya in order to save unknown teenagers from a world he had not seen. It is unlikely that the bodies of the last victims, whose torment in the room below Protopopov could not bear to say, would ever be found. After the 1977 debacle, the Shavalevs must have been very seriously concerned about getting rid of the corpses. The sinister room downstairs, like the Shavalevs' dacha, is impossible to examine today in the 90s. As part of the master plan for the neighborhood, the 5 dachas located there were bought and demolished by the state. In that place, there is now concreted land and a large medical complex near a blooming edge, where patients can enjoy an invigorating walk in the forest on summer days. A forest where people to this day see wandering yellow orbs. A forest in the midst of which may still look a mysterious passage to the overworld.